It's all happening at the Politicrat Daily Podcast online store, and you can go there right now at the-politicrat.myshopify.com. Lots of good new items, brand new, designed by yours truly. So please head to the Politicrat Daily Podcast online store now. Thank you very much.
Anytime you beg another man to set you free, you will never be free. Freedom is something that you have to do for yourself. Just like the white man in America brought about freedom for himself by letting the people who oppressed him and colonized him know that he was willing to pay the price. And until the American Negro lets the white man know that we are really ready and willing to pay the price that is necessary for freedom, our people will always be walking around here second-class citizens, or what you call 20th century slaves.
What price are you talking about, sir?
The price of freedom is death.
Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Sunday, February the 21st, 2021. On this edition of the Politicrat,
he raised his hand in a Muslim greeting, Salam Alaikum. At that point, I heard a rumbling behind me, and I'm sure everyone else did too, and I turned around in my seat to see what it was. And then I saw two guys standing up, and the next thing, my next impression, it all happened very rapidly, as you can understand, is of the gunshots. And I saw Malcolm had his hand up. He said, stay cool, stay calm, or something like that. And just then the gunfire went off, and his hand was up. I remember this. I turned around quickly, and the next thing I saw was Malcolm falling back in a dead faint.
February 21st, 1965. That was the date of a very sad moment for America and in American history. Malcolm X assassinated on this Sunday, some 56 years ago. It's a difficult one, this one, but it's not going to only be about Malcolm's assassination.
My mother threw herself over her babies, and she yelled out, "They're killing my husband."
I heard shots, and I saw people crawling on the floor. And so I got down too. Then when I was looking out, and I saw someone look in amazement to the front, I knew they had shot my husband.
He sustained one shot in the lower right chin, and the other 6 hit him in the chest and body.
I looked out at him and I said, he's going to die. I kept saying to myself, he's going to die, he's going to die.
So this is the very day, some 56 years ago, on Sunday, February 21st, that one of the most important and influential figures in American history was assassinated. El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, otherwise known as Malcolm X, otherwise known as Malcolm Little, was assassinated on this date in 1965. Sunday, February the 21st, 1965. And as you heard there, that was, and I'm not sure, I don't want to get the name wrong, so I'm not going to say the name. A young brother who I believe may have been part of the Nation of Islam, describing what he witnessed on that horrible day 56 years ago. And that newsreel clip that you heard in the opening was from that very day, literally a few minutes after Malcolm was assassinated. I tried to think about how I was going to approach this, because I think that there's a great deal of fetishization around Black Death in general. There is a lot of fetishizing of Black Death in American society and in American culture. And I am very wary of it, as I'm sure you are as well. There is a sense of glorification of death, of Black Death, by the white power structure and white society, the media. And so I certainly do not want to be part of that. And I really do hope, dear listener, that when and as you listen to this particular episode, that you come to understand or believe that what you're hearing is not about trying to fetishize anything around Malcolm X. It is to, I think, and I hope, give him the proper respect. And for that matter, give Dr. Betty Shabazz, who is also no longer here with us, the proper respect. I wrestled with whether or not I should even talk about the assassination. And then I decided, well, to not talk about it would also be a disservice, would be a disservice. But I also came to the conclusion that talking only about February 21st, 1965, a Sunday afternoon, actually, in Harlem, USA, at the Audobon Ballroom, talking only about that for this episode would, I think, also be a disservice. So what you're going to be hearing during this episode is not only the audio, a few more clips of audio from that day, that Sunday afternoon in Harlem, really in Washington Heights area of Harlem, in Washington Heights. I believe it was around 166th Street or on the west side of New York City there. But you're also going to be hearing some of what Malcolm had to say during his life, his very brief life. He was only 39 years of age when he was assassinated. And you're also going to be hearing yours truly reading excerpts from Malcolm's autobiography, which is what you must read. If you have not read the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley, then you are really missing out, and you must read it. Make that your next reading assignment. And really, I know people read or listen to audiobooks, but you really have to read this one. You really do. So that's what I'll also be doing, in addition to talking about that really horrific day 56 years ago. I wonder about this whole situation because, again, as I said at the beginning, this society fetishizes Black Death. We see it all the time in the numerous videos that get played over and over and over again on the news media of Black people being shot down dead by police. We see this over and over and over again. And it's typically white police that do this, but there are Black police who do this as well. But typically that's what we see over and over on a loop. It is numbing. It is designed to numb. It is designed to send a signal to other, I believe, white police officers or police officers in general, and white people in general, and Black people in general too. It's a re-traumatizing technique. It's a re-traumatizing that goes on and on and on. And we've seen this so many times. I can name the names of people. Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd. I can go Tatiana Jefferson. There's so many people. Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, over and over and over again, where our bodies, black bodies, are being displayed for, quite frankly, and this is brutally honest from my view, this is my brutal opinion about this, is that it's for amusement and the entertainment of a demented section of our society that loves this. It's as if there's a hearkening back to the days of open lynching, public lynchings of black people. And you would see these white families, and I've talked about this many times here, white families with their kids, their girls and their boys, couldn't be more than 6 or 7 years old, and they're standing there smiling while the dangling feet of a lynched black person can be seen just within view. Or the whole picture of a person can be seen lynched while you've got white families laughing and pointing at the body of a black person who has been hung, who has been lynched like that, who has been lynched, castrated, disemboweled. And sometimes I do think, dear listener, that when you see these videos on television, racked up, re-racked, over and over on a loop, over and over and over and over again, it has the functional equivalent of doing exactly the same thing. Playing gleefully to this audience of people who have a bloodlust. There are people who get off on black death. There are people who get off on all kinds of death because that's just, you're going to have human beings who do that, who get off on that, literally. Now, I don't know any of them personally, and I'm not one of them either. But I'm just saying something that is true. And I don't know if you are one of those kinds of individuals, but please don't tell me that you are. But if you are, keep that to yourself, please. But seriously, that is a reality. I mean, films like Pulp Fiction have chronicled stuff like this in some ways. That there is this segment of society that gets off on, of this anti-black racist society that gets off on this system of whiteness that perpetuates this kind of thing and gets off on it and makes money off of it, I might add. And it seems like a continual parading of our bodies. And that, I must say, before I even get to speaking about Malcolm X more specifically, this parading of black death, and sometimes it's trafficked in by rappers who are black. Sometimes it's trafficked in, in the records that they have gangster rap, and that's kind of, I don't know. I don't think that's really a thing anymore. I mean, I'm sure it is a thing in some aspects of the record business, which promotes it, of course. The white record business, the white producers who, the owners of record labels who are overwhelmingly white. And there, of course, there are people like Suge Knight, too. I mean, my goodness, I'm not going to leave him out. Black man and guy who's constantly in prison. Death Row Records, I mean, so it's not, I'm not going to make it like there's not black people that do this, too, because as I've just said, there are. So it would be grossly misrepresentative on my part to you, dear listener, to pretend that there aren't black folk who have a hand in this too. Of course there are. Just like there were in enslavement days where there are black folk who were working for massa and were doing everything at massa's bidding at the detriment and to the detriment of black people who were enslaved. So I'm not going to pretend that there weren't some of us who did this to us and who played a part in executing the plan of the white enslaver. And that I'm not going to shy away from. But I do want to get to this central point and just finish it out here, is that this is all part of the same parade. Whether it is the loop of a video over and over of one of us getting shot dead, whether it is all the coverage of the assassinations of black leaders, whether it is enslavement and us being paraded around on an auction block. I mean, I honestly do not see any distinction between those. And I know someone's going to go, what? Really? You don't see a difference? Really, Omar, between that? I'm not saying they're exactly the same thing. That's not what I just said. What I said was, and is, there is functionally no difference. I don't really see one in kind. Now, obviously, there are some operative differences. Someone being put on an auction block, as we were as black people, put on an auction block. I shared a video on Twitter through my Twitter handle, @thepopcorn, REEL, just the other day. Earlier last week, it was probably Monday. And the National History Museum of African American Heritage, or I may have transposed a number of those words, but it's the Smithsonian Museum, the National Museum of the History of African American Heritage. You know the one in Washington, D.C., that's developed by the Bunch family, I believe. It's one where you've got like a year or two waiting list to get in to see artifacts. Now, goodness knows with this pandemic how that shakes out now. But there was something from that was on C-SPAN the other day here in the U.S., and it was a moment from a presentation that one of the curators at the museum was explaining, and she said, or someone said, if it wasn't a she, it may have been a he, I don't remember. But the point is, the person said that there was a boy, a black boy, who was auctioned off for $5. Do you hear me? There was a black boy at an enslavement auction here in the United States of America who had been sold off for $5. You really do have to understand that when we talk about enslavement and we talk about black people and we talk about systems, and I talk about systems and language and what language we are using to describe all of this, you have to look at this with open eyes. This isn't a card, as I said a few days ago, that we are playing. This is not a card. Enslavement is not a card. Racism is not a card. We as black people are not a card to be played, that we just flick out of our back pocket and put on a table. I've said this before here. I've said this during the discussion that I hosted just over a week ago that I treated you to. If you've listened to it, you know. If you haven't, please do listen to that episode from a few days ago when I talked about Anita Hill in conjunction with the documentary Anita Speaking Truth to Power, directed by Frida Lee Mock from 2013. It's available on Tubi, Tubi. Download that app and you'll get to be able to watch it for free. Free. It's 77 minutes long. It's really quick. And I talked about gender, and I talked about race and racism, and I talked about systems. and you heard various people, predominantly, overwhelmingly white, 98% of that audience was white, and you heard some of the questions that they were asking me, that some of those white participants were asking me on Zoom about the film, about racism, gender, and of course, this offensive term that I find highly offensive, the race card, which is something that this system frequently has people talking about. A system that oppresses and dominates black people, oppresses and enslaves black people, is developing language, race card. How arrogant is that, by the way? You know? And then you have a participant in the conversation, and that person also, didn't Clarence Thomas use that? No, he didn't. And I explained what Clarence Thomas was doing. And he was doing what he did at the expense of gender, at the expense of Anita Hill's womanhood, her personhood, her genderhood. That's what I was explaining to the person who asked me the question. And that's what I explained again in a subsequent episode of this podcast. It is about language. And when I say to you that a boy was auctioned off for $5, a black boy, I am not making this up. This has happened, and it did happen every day in this country, called the US of A. While the country was being developed by the founding fathers, that's what was happening to us. So we have to reframe the language and change it and start to look at the system that's producing the language. And then we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do? And what should we do to unlearn? Not only to unlearn, but to thrive and succeed, and to start developing a system that recognizes and respects the humanity of black people, and have laws that reflects that respect for our humanity. I know I veered off topic, but I am going to get back to the intents of this episode. And I'm going to do that with Malcolm X right after this.
He expected it. Do you think he expected it this soon?
Well, I have no idea whether he expected this soon or not, but I think the press and the police attitude towards what he was saying about the different things was not very fair. The police and the press tried to make it look like he bummed his own home, which was ridiculous. He had no insurance on the furniture or himself or anything like that. And now I guess they'll say he shot himself.
Welcome back. Yes, this was such a sad day. This is not an anniversary. When someone is assassinated, or somebody passes away from anything, whether it's COVID-19 or cancer or organ failure of some kind, whatever it might be, or when someone's assassinated, as I said, I don't think that if this happened in your family, and you know of the losses you've had in your family, you know of the losses you've had in your life of people who are near and dear to you, family, friends, spouse, you would not be saying that this is the 3rd anniversary of my spouse's death. I don't think you would. No, I might be arrogant in that kind of presumption, but I don't think I am. But if I am, I'm always someone who is willing to be challenged and corrected. Because if you're not, then you're really not doing something right. If you're not willing to be open to receive different points of view, ones that are based on something other than, obviously, something that's not lies, then, that's not a good thing. I've got to be open to that. But I am saying that I doubt that many people, I'll put it this way, I doubt that many people say this is the 5th anniversary of the death of someone in my family. The 5th anniversary? I don't think that you remember it like that. I don't think you characterize it that way. And for those reasons, and for any other reason, I'm not going to be saying, oh, this is the 56th anniversary. And that's what you hear people say on the news. This is the 56th. It's not an anniversary. An anniversary is something special, like your wedding, right? Like, like your wedding. Think about it. You renew your wedding vows. You renew your marriage vows. Anniversaries. Oh, the anniversary of some milestone that you reached. Some accomplishment that you achieved, that you reached. That was great. That's what an anniversary is. Your high school reunion. My 55th anniversary. That's what you talk about, anniversaries in that spirit. So that's what that is. February 21st, 1965. It was such a horrible day in the United States of America. It was a Sunday, as is this day, that this episode is being recorded. It was wintry. It was New York City. It was the Audobon Ballroom. And I'm going to play this bit of audio here now for you. And the brother that you're going to hear from, and again, I don't want to get his name wrong, is going to set the scene. He was there. And this is what he said on February 21st, 1965.
He raised his hand in a Muslim greeting, Salam Alaikum. At that point, I heard a rumbling behind me, and I'm sure everyone else did too, and I turned around in my seat to see what it was. And then I saw two guys standing up, and my next impression, it all happened very rapidly, as you can understand, is of the gunshots. And I saw Malcolm had his hand up. He said, stay cool, stay calm, or something like that. And just then the gunfire went off, and his hand was up. I remember this. I turned around quickly, and the next thing I saw was Malcolm falling back in a dead faint. Right after that, of course, like everybody else, chairs were being knocked over. There were screams. Everybody was in a mad confusion. I dove to the floor and scrambled behind a rampart on the side. My first impression was, of course, as a reporter, to get to a telephone and file my story. And I started crawling towards the back of the auditorium. And I incidentally saw a guy running out. Evidently, one of the perpetrators running out, and he was shooting like a cowboy all over the place. And of course, the shots were going off wildly. And after that, there was pandemonium in the place.
That was the eyewitness account of someone who, this person, and I really wish I remembered his name, was an eyewitness. And I should point out, because I don't want to disaggregate this from anything, that in that audience at the Audubon Ballroom on that day, 56 years ago today, was Dr. Betty Shabazz, and Malcolm was her husband, and at least 3 of their young children were with her in the audience. Ilyasa, I believe. Well, Ilyasa, I think, is the youngest. Attila, I think, is the oldest child. She was there, and so were 2 other children, to the best of my recollection. They saw all of this happen right before their eyes. their dad was gunned down in such a horrible, brutal way. It was just awful. Awful. And it was black men who did it. I can hear those people now. Black on black violence. No. Hold on a minute now. Obviously, a black man killed another black man, or black men killed a black man. So you can call it that. Of course you're going to. Those who listen to this podcast, who love to delight in those things, but don't call out anything that a violent white system does to black and white people every day, right? You want to talk about white on some violence. White, how about that violence? A systemic white on black violence, or a systemic white on white violence that happens every day. But, I know people, those individuals who operate in that kind of phony reality that's not even real, it's just absolute lies, are going to operate on that. I want people to understand and remember that this killing of Malcolm X, this assassination of Malcolm X, didn't as horrible as it was, it didn't happen with him on some trip somewhere where nobody saw it. This happened in front of a whole lot of people, including his wife and his children. His wife and his children. Betty and Malcolm had 6 children, all daughters. Betty, Dr. Betty, is no longer here with us either. And the circumstances around that, which I won't go into, but perhaps should, is also horrific. It really is. I think it would be better to devote an entire episode to Dr. Shabazz. And that's something that I will certainly be doing down the road here. But that day scarred us all. At least we have people who fight because they fight for us and they care about us. And what they do with their lives is an example for us all, for the fights to come, the struggles to come. No human civilization, no human society is able to float through life unless there is some struggle. You can't float through life. Let me just be a bit more crystal clear here. There is no life that you can live without struggle in it, some way, somehow. And so, Malcolm being assassinated did not stop the rest of us from doing what we had to do to struggle for and activate for and advocate for a more just, society, a society that treats Black people with respect. And as I said earlier, pushing and working hard for laws that changed the reality in this country for Black people in the United States. And by the way, I should say that just people forget this, and this is why it's important. This is why dates are very important. I'm telling you, dates are really important, and I talk about them a lot. If you're someone who listens to this podcast on any kind of regular basis, I do talk about dates a lot. And that's really important. Dates in history. Among, obviously, the historical events, but dates, moments. Everybody remembers September 11th, 2001. Everybody remembers that. But I want to paint this picture for you at this moment, dear listener. Sunday, February 21st, 1965. And this does not get easy to do. This is not easy to do. I must be quite frank with you. Friday, I keep saying Friday. Sunday, February the 21st, 1965. And what happened exactly 2 Sundays later? Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. So 2 weeks after Malcolm was assassinated, 2 Sundays after Malcolm was assassinated, black people were being beaten by police, by white police, on the Edmund Pettus Klansman's Bridge. In Selma, Alabama. 2 weeks later, 2 Sundays later, Malcolm X assassinated on Sunday, February 21st, 1965. And 2 Sundays later, Sunday, March 7th, 1965, white police specifically, beating John Lewis, Amelia Boynton, and numerous others on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and in that area of Selma in Alabama. You see why history is important? And you know you've never heard those 2 dates being tied together at all. You may never have heard that. Now, it may have dawned upon you that one was 2 weeks after the other. May have. But you've never seen those 2 dates or heard of those 2 dates being connected together. Certainly not in the media. Certainly not in the media that you presumably watch or listen to. Have you heard? Oh, Sunday, February 21st, 1965. And then just 2 weeks later, Sunday, March 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, Selma, Alabama. Think about that for a second. And there's no accident why those dates don't get tied together, why you don't hear that in your friendly neighborhood corporate news media. Tie those dates together. Think about why you don't. This attempt to disaggregate everything and stick it out of context as if these are happening in separate silos, these atrocities happening as if they are in separate silos, and somehow, oh, no, that's just one event over there, and there's another one over here, but we're not going to tie all this stuff together. Oh, no. You have to. These things do not happen in a vacuum. And that's my point. But I do want to say that this was a really difficult day. It really was in 1965. And these men, these black men who shot and killed Malcolm, one of them who actually pulled the trigger, I think, was the one who is still serving time or died in prison, Talmadge Hayer, who is a person in the Nation of Islam. And the other 2 people, there is speculation as to whether they're even the right people. And there is a documentary on Netflix called Who Killed Malcolm X? I believe it's still on Netflix, that goes into a lot of this investigation. Well, you can check that documentary out. It's got multiple parts to it. And I do recommend it. It's worth watching just to see the kind of really exhaustive work that this particular brother, and I forget his name, has done in order to put all of this together. Because he's been on a basically one-man investigative tear on this for decades. And so I think you owe it to yourself to look at that. But again, my focus is not on the mechanics behind it. It's of the day, of the man, and of the people. And also, you're going to be hearing from Malcolm. And you're going to be hearing from him, from me, right now, as I read from today's recommended book, which is a recommended book that you could recommend on any day of any week of any year. And that is the autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley, last name Haley. I'm reading from the chapter called Hustler. And this is in the day when Malcolm was in his hustling days. Malcolm went through many transformations, as I think that those who are aware of Malcolm X understand and know. Malcolm Little, born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925 on the date of May the 19th. In fact, I did a podcast episode on that date last year, and I'll be doing one again on that date this year. God willing, knock on wood, of course. But I do want to say that he was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and born to an American father and a mother from Grenada. And he went through these metamorphoses because his father was killed at a relatively early age, I think, for Malcolm. You know, I mean, the Klan murdered Malcolm's father, who was a very much an activist, someone who was a part of the Back to Africa movement that had been spearheaded and begun by Marcus Garvey. And Malcolm's father was brutally murdered by the Klan, brutally murdered. They tied him up, put him on, I believe, a train track, or in the middle of the road, tied him up in a rope. He couldn't move, and a train ran over him, or a cable car ran over him. I mean, that's what they did to Malcolm's father. That's what these murderous Klan did to him. So, Malcolm's life began in a real arena, or his developing life, grew out of, he was surrounded by violence. His mother had mental challenges of mental health, and she had to be committed, as they call it. I don't like that word, but that's one of the words that was used. She was put in I think an asylum or something. And it was really despairing for Malcolm to see his mother in this situation. His mother and father always told him to stand up and stand tall. And he grew up, and, he was a very smart, bright, intelligent person. Wanted to be a lawyer. He never lived that out. And the circumstances changed, and having grown up in that violent environment, and basically, now is essentially an orphan because both of his parents, one, had died in a mental home as far as I remember, and his father was brutally murdered by the Klan. Malcolm was left to fend in the world by himself and for himself. And he did turn to the street. he did turn to hustling. He did turn to being Detroit Red, to being Satan, as he was called, in his further transformations. He transformed 6 or 7 times in his life, which is more than most of us ever do in our lives. And he only lived for 39 years. Now, I want to read to you now, giving you that little bit of context. And I urge you, please, if you have not read the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley, please do. Please do. You are doing yourself a profound disservice in not having read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I may actually end up giving away some copies of the autobiography of Malcolm X. Anyway, I'll talk about that maybe a little later on or in another episode. You have to read the book. So with the context I've just laid out, I'm going to read to you a small portion of something from his Hustler days, from the chapter Hustler, from the autobiography of Malcolm X. The hypocritical white man will talk about the Negro's low morals. But who has the world's lowest morals, if not whites? And not only that, but the upper class whites. Recently, details were published about a group of suburban New York City white housewives and mothers operating as a professional call girl ring. In some cases, these wives were out prostituting with the agreement, even the cooperation, of husbands, some of whom even waited at home attending the children. And the customers, to quote a major New York City morning newspaper, quote, some 16 ledgers and books with names of 200 Johns, many important social, financial, and political figures, were seized in the raid Friday night, end quote. I have also read recently about groups of young white couples who get together. The husbands throw their house keys, into a hat, then, blindfolded, the husbands draw out a key and spend the night with the wife that the house key matches. I have never heard of anything like that being done by Negroes, even Negroes who live in the worst ghettos and alleys and gutters. That was Malcolm X in the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. That chapter I read from just now was the chapter Hustler. And I tell you, I read that particularly because it's true. I mean, everything that Malcolm is saying in his autobiography is, it's true. I mean, not that he would lie to you. It's true. And I know all of this stuff is true that he's talking about, not just this, but anything. Just look at, there's been movies done about it. That's how I know it's foundationally true. The keys in the bowl, which movie did you notice that in? It's a movie I talk about from time to time. On Twitter at the Popcorn REEL, not necessarily on the podcast that I've been doing here, the episode. The Ice Storm. Ong Lee, you remember that movie? And that's a good movie, by the way. There's scenes in that movie from the early, and I think the movie's set in the early 1970s. Or the late 1960s, early 1970s in Connecticut. Bored, lonely, white housewife. It's that whole thing. Oh, I'm bored. Oh, I'm lonely. I'm going to do this. I'm going to walk the earth. I really shouldn't be producing any moments of levity here because this is not the point. But the point is that that's true. I'm not even necessarily passing a judgment on it. I'm just saying observationally and functionally that is true, right? And what he said is really true. And anybody who is white, who is a housewife or may not be a so-called housewife, that term now is probably it's not a term many of us use these days. But anyone who is white and who stays at home, whether they be male or female, but if they are female, they know of this. I'm not saying that they themselves have done this. I'm saying that would not be a shock to them if you told them that went on. They wouldn't sit there and go, "Oh my God!" Right? Go and watch The Ice Storm by Ang Lee. I think it's one of Ang Lee's better movies, actually. Eat, Drink, Man, Woman is probably his best. And then, of course, I know people will say, I think Brokeback Mountain was a good film. I wouldn't say that it's his best film, but I do think it's a good film because I think the story is good, generally speaking. And then there's, of course, some of the other ones that Ang Lee is more well known for on the commercial basis. But the point I'm making is that Ang Lee directed The Ice Storm. And there's scenes in there with the house keys. That was very popular in America, in white American circles. And that in mostly upper middle class, and as he points out in that portion, upper class circles. And yes, black folk have never done, and I agree with that. I mean, could there be somewhere where that's happened? But I've never heard of that. I've never heard of it. But what the point is that he's painting this picture of what we are socialized about, that black folk are somehow depraved, and that's what Malcolm's talking about there. Right? And all the other things that I read in that little excerpt from Hustler, not the magazine, the chapter of Malcolm's book, Autobiography of Malcolm X. There's a chapter called Hustler. And no, it is not to be thought of as the magazine that Larry Flint, who passed away a few weeks ago now. No. This is not that, please. But this is what he's saying there, Malcolm, is very true. And it's funny because I dovetail it with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which, of course, in yesterday's episode, I celebrated and honored the legendary living legend that is Sidney Poitier. So Sidney Poitier, who had his 94th birthday yesterday. And so Turner Classic Movies played two of his films. One of them was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and they played the two most white-friendly, white, comforting types of Sidney Poitier film that they could play. They did not play In the Heat of the Night, although they had played In the Heat of the Night a couple of weeks prior, and they did not play Raisin in the Sun, which I think they should have done, although they did play that a week or two prior. But anyway, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner really kind of glosses over a lot of the stuff that Malcolm talks about in that excerpt and goes completely in a different direction. And it's a film I'm not a fan of. And I would dare say, I know black folk are not a monolith, but I would bet you that you wouldn't find too many black people saying, "Oh, that's a great movie, and I'm a fan of it," or "I liked it." Where you'll get a lot more white people saying that they liked it, because I think it, in part, is aspirational for them, for white people, and for some white people. I'm not saying everybody, but for the white people who do like that film, I'm going to suggest that it is because there is an aspirational bent to it that defies reality in 1967. Because that was the same year Loving versus Virginia was decided, if I'm not mistaken. The Supreme Court decision, right? Loving versus Virginia. That ended the ban on so-called miscegenation, which the ban on black people and white people being able to marry each other. So this is why I keep telling you, dates are very important. Do not shirk dates. I've tried to think of another term, but that was the only one I could really come up with. You know, do not skimp on them. I think that's really what I was trying to get to. Loving versus Virginia. And that's the thing. And this is what I believe. I want to make sure I get the actual year correct. Loving versus Virginia was I was correct. 1967. I knew it. I knew I was getting it right somehow. It's just... Oh, dear me. June of 1967. And that film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, came out in 1967. And I just divert not quite entirely from what Malcolm says in his autobiography, but to look at when this whole situation arose and how a film like that is very dishonest about black and white relations, whether it is romantic, sexual, or otherwise. It's very dishonest. And it's dishonest about the transactional nature of them. This movie came out in December of 1967. So that would have been 6 months after Loving v. Virginia was decided in the U.S. Supreme Court. And that was the decision that said black people and God, can't even speak. That was the decision that said that black people and white people could marry each other. They were no longer prohibited from doing so. 1967. That's less than 60 years ago. So, when we say love is love, and I believe that it is, truly I do. But some people who say it, do they really mean it? Or is it some trendy phrase that Lin-Manuel Miranda may have said? Or others may have said before him, I don't know. Because it's not trendy, and I don't think that Lin-Manuel thinks it's trendy either. I think he means it. I know he means. Come on, he means it. But we are very dishonest about the way that we behave with each other. And in America, we're very, and in the UK as well, my native home country where I was born and raised and grew up. I mean, we're dishonest about it there too. We're very dishonest there about it. Even more so, I think, in the United Kingdom, are we dishonest about it than we are here in America. I mean, I think here in the US of A, at least, there are people who are open to having conversations and confronting and looking at the realities. But we still are very much dishonest, and the films reflect the dishonesty. And so, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is really a disaster. And it's not a Sidney Poitier film. It's more a Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn movie. Because Spencer Tracy, rest his soul, literally passed away within 1 month of the ending of the filming. Certainly his filming in that movie, he passed away. He was very ill during that film. But the whole point I'm making is that the film itself is really dishonest about the black-white interaction. And we've been dishonest about it. The country, America's been dishonest about it from before enslavement, right? We don't have the proper girding here, the guts, the gumption, the will to openly lay on the table the atrocities that the systemic white society and the white society has done to black people. People aren't, we have forums and we have commissions and studies. We had the Kerner Commission in 65 or 67 or whenever that was, Kerner Commission, 2 white, 2 Americas, 1 white and 1 black. Yes. Hello. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, the Kerner Commission was not an entire waste of time. But this is the ambit of where Malcolm comes in, because I think the Kerner Commission came in after he was assassinated. But we are dishonest about the black-white interposition and interaction. It's been a very violent one. It's been a complex one in some ways, but it's been a very bloody one, right? And that's not just true of the United States. It's been a sexual one. It's been this forbidden fruit, that kind of nonsense, which is, I shouldn't call it nonsense. It's a real thing. It still is a real thing, but that's a kind way of putting it. It's, well, we can't have my daughter, we can't have my daughter with that black guy over there, that kind of thing. Or, and there's some black folks that are like, look, no, you're not bringing home some white heifer, I mean, I'm not trying to make any light of this. But there's deep-rooted things going on in there. And if in particular, and let me just start it like this, the black woman and the white man relationship, oh my goodness me. Because we don't want to, ever. Not you and I, but we as a society in America. Oh, we don't want to talk about that, do we? You know, the raping of black women by white men in enslavement times. We don't want to talk about that congressman over there or that senator over here, that white senator. He fathered a black child and he was a segregationist. Strom Thurmond. We don't want to talk about that. But you see, that's the thing, right? And because people don't want to look at the society, we just let the complexity and the dangers and the violence and the killing of black people continue. Because people refuse to look. And the system is not going to change. It's going to continue to perpetuate and enforce and enact and activate and do those things, those atrocities against black people. And the black woman is absolutely attacked and eviscerated in that scenario, in that reality, but stands tall today and still and has throughout history. Let me not make this completely one-sided. Black women stand, and they still stand, despite all of that happened to them. All of it. They stood and still stand and still lead. They lead. You know? They lead. They just don't know. They just don't know what they ever tried to get into when they tried to come up against a black woman. You just don't know what this is. So this is the ambit. What I'm talking about is not as diversionary as you might think, or even as I might postulate. This is about something real, and it comes back to what we fail to look at. And Malcolm hits it right there. And if we were honest about that, that the society that we're in knows the deal on all of this, and then has these laws, these black folk and white folk can't get together. They're going to get together, whether a law prohibits them or not, by the way. And by the way, can we also talk about white women and black men? Can we also talk about that scenario? And again, I'm not passing judgment on any of these things. I'm just trying to look at history. And I'm trying to look at the continuum, right? These things were underground, but you know what? Let's not forget ever that the white women who did what I'm about to talk to you about did what they did to uphold the structure of a systemic violence and a systemic white violence against black people, against black men, against black women, against black people. When some of those white women in the South, and not just in the South, by the way, all over the country, don't tell me that it's just the South, because it ain't. And you can read the books and the accounts on this, who would say things like, oh, that black guy over there, he forced himself on me. When actually, that did not happen. And actually, you might find that not only did it not happen, but it was the black man actually refused the entreaties and advances of the white woman, who was either the mistress of the house, for lack of a more correct word, or the owner of the house, the enslavement mistress, right? And she wanted that black book. I hate that word because it's so racist and stereotypical. But that's the mentality that some of these white women had. And damn it, I'm going to have him, and damn you. And it would be an act of retaliation or an act of presumptuousness against the white husband, right? So while the white husband was out there raping the black woman, and the white woman knew this in the South and elsewhere, knew this. Now, I'm going to have me some black. Well, you know what comes after that. I'm not going to, even though I've used that term before on this podcast. That's what the ambit is, right? And so, and it would usually be some brother who, you know, is enslaved. This ain't the house Negro we're talking about here, as Malcolm would say. This is a brother who had been working from sun up to sundown, from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, as Malcolm would say. And she'd say, come over here. And she would be aggressive toward him. And a lot of, he'd say no. And then she'd lie and say, as Carolyn Donham did, Carolyn Donham Bryant, or whatever her last name is now, said, oh, Emmett Till, he just, he whistled at me and propositioned me, lied. And then he died and was murdered. He was murdered by a white mob because a white woman lied. And that would happen. That happened 100-fold in those enslavement days. 100-fold, 200-fold. Happened a lot. How many black men died on a lie that a white woman told because, he rebuffed her advances? Or that it was consensual, as a lot of this was, too. There was a fair amount of this that was consensual. And the white woman would lie. Would lie. And, of course, the white man would not want to possibly believe that this white woman that he had married to would somehow be interested in a black. Oh, no, that we just know. So it was you, black man, that must pay. It's that whole white Southern womanhood thing on a pedestal, which, again, is not just limited to the South. And then that brother would be executed, tortured. And it goes back to this. This is related to Malcolm, what I just read to you about 10 whatever minutes ago now. So these things do have a continuum to them. And when I do bring up subjects, you may think that I'm vacillating wildly, even though I say that sometimes. I am really not. I guess this is what an unscripted podcast does for you. It allows you to ruminate and kind of go through these different avenues and tributaries that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do in a scripted thing. But I don't know, because this is not scripted. Nor is life, although some might tend to disagree with me on that. When I come back, you're going to hear from Malcolm.
$22 million black victims of Americanism are waking up, and they're gaining a new political consciousness, becoming politically mature. And as they develop this political maturity, they're able to see the recent trends in these political elections. They see that the whites are so evenly divided that every time they vote, the race is so close, they have to go back and count the votes all over again. And which means that any block, any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who go to the White House and who stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to his Texas cotton patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they've brought it up and gotten it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first and they put you last. Because you're a chump. A political chump. In Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives, there are 257 who are Democrats. Only 177 are Republican. In the Senate, there are 67 Democrats. Only 33 are Republicans. The party that you backed controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you because you're a chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race.
That was Malcolm X in 1964, talking about voting, the importance of voting, and also about political parties and the Democratic Party in particular, which continues in some great measure to take black people for granted, I think, in large measure. And now what I think the Democratic Party is doing is using black politicians, some of them, using some black politicians in the Democratic Party to signal to black people that the Democratic Party is taking them for granted. I mean, seriously, that's another topic for another day, but the reason I tie that in is because I want to tie in what Malcolm said in the 1960s and thereabouts to what is happening now in 2021 and beyond. Because this is important. I think that when we look at Malcolm X, we must look at him, of course, in his time. He was ahead of his time in his time. But also look at him now and look back now at what he said then. And marry that into a mission statement to go forth. The ancestors provide things, models of things for us to do. And I don't think it's good enough for us to celebrate and remember, memorialize, remember, celebrate the lives of people without not also asking ourselves what we can do to propel ourselves and a nation and a people forward. How can we be our better selves? How can we be our better selves so that we can try to strive to be our best selves? Because as Malcolm X showed, we are all constantly in a state of learning. We are all constantly searching for something to elevate the consciousness. I hope we are. Many of us are. Malcolm certainly was. He continued to evolve as a person. And we do learn every day and hopefully grow every day. But do we evolve every day? Do we try every day to gain a higher footing in our own sense of being? And it's not even something that has to be spiritual, although I think inherently there is a spiritual content to it. But as I have said in recent episodes, what kinds of things are you doing with the time that you have given to you? And that's one of the keys. And I think Malcolm did that. Malcolm used time. He was someone who was very, very stressed time. Very mindful of it, I should say. And how time was so important to him. And he utilized it, even when he was behind bars in his days before he became Malcolm X, before he got to the Nation of Islam, when in prison. In the, late 1940s to early 1950s or whenever, when he was in prison, he made use of every single second, copied out an entire dictionary, every single word, memorized those words, studied them. He did anything that lots of people wouldn't do. Because in prison, all you have is time. And Malcolm really marked it, every moment of it, every moment. Except for when he was sleeping. He was constantly reading, constantly studying, constantly writing, interpreting. And then he became the person that you saw in the 1960s. Sure, he was mentored, but he did this work. And he kept doing it. And he died doing it. And I think that on a very sad day as this one, and I know some people will say, well, this is a celebratory day because we're celebrating his life. And yeah, I see that, but this is a sad day also. I mean, this person that we lost, who was violently taken from us, I mean, this guy meant so much to so many millions of people. And even when some black folk were afraid of him, it was only after he left that some of them looked back and said, wow, he was something else. And you've got generations of black people now, generations of white kids now, and white people who are a little bit older than that, who study Malcolm X, who've read the autobiography, people all over the world. The autobiography of Malcolm X, as I've said before here, is one of the probably top 3 or 4 most read books in the history of the planet. That is not an exaggeration. Next to the Bible and, really, literally, the autobiography of Malcolm X is one of the top 4 or 5 most read books ever. And it's still immensely popular. It's been translated into close to 100, if not more, languages. Global book, global. I know white people who are fascinated by Malcolm X. Fascinated by him as a person all throughout his life. I know someone in particular who is talking to me about Malcolm X and talking about he did this, and I said yes he did, and talks to me about Malcolm X and how what Malcolm X meant to them. And one of the things I say is you have to act in his way. And I'm not saying you have to make a speech. I'm not saying you have to go before the cameras. But what I'm saying is you have to act in his way. Act in his spirit. Activate yourself. It's not enough to be woke. Again, a horrible word. Horrible, toxic, horrible, horrible word. Ooh, woke? What? Choke is more like it. That's a horrible word. And I shouldn't even be using that word either. I am very attuned and sensitive to the kinds of words I use. constantly. And maybe someone says, oh, that's too much. That's just too much work. Oh my gosh, just relax. It's not about relaxing. I do relax. I do that. This is something that is much more than someone's privileged shout or someone's concerned shout. We have to be active in our way, whatever form that manifests itself in for you. You cannot let a day go by where you are not doing something to either better your life in terms of your everyday, better yourself. That's what I mean. Or bettering the world that you are living in. And it doesn't have to be some big, grandiose measure. It can be something really small and deeply personal to you. The kind of thing you might put in a diary. The kind of thing you might say on Twitter, although, or not say on Twitter. Sometimes less is more. A lot of times less is more. Sometimes you don't have to broadcast everything. And I think that's another thing. I don't think Malcolm X would have ever gone on Twitter, by the way. I don't think he would have. I could be very wrong about that. His message was too big for a social platform. But we've got to act. We've got to act in his way. Act in his way. And resist the buzzwords of the moment, the catchphrases of the moment, the ones that the system that governs us all uses. And then the politicians repeat it as a mantra, but then don't do anything about it, but hold commissions and investigations. If anybody ever tells you, and Malcolm would have said this to you too, I'm almost certain of it. If anybody tells you that you need a commission to study oppression, to study systemic whiteness and white violence against black people in an anti-black racist society and system that's institutional, if anybody tells you that you need a commission, a study to investigate this, just ignore them. That's the very least of it. Malcolm might have said something else other than that, but just ignore them and know that it's a complete waste of time. The system will never investigate itself. And Malcolm said the same thing, but in different words. And he said this in many occasions. You take your criminal to court. That's one of the things he said. The world court. He wanted to take this whole system to the world court, the United States. That's what Malcolm wanted to do. The world court in The Hague. He wanted to take this for what it was doing to, at the time, 20 to 25 million black people in the United States. That call has not been followed up on since. And instead now we've got something very different going on, which I will talk about, I'm sure, in the future. But Malcolm X, even on a day as sad and as solemn as this, is still in our realm as someone who has instructed us, who has taught us. And we've got to draw lessons from what he has done and said so that we can make the world a more just world for black people, for brown people, native people, and have a better planet for all of us. We must have justice. That is the key. And there's no peace and there is no unity without justice. It just doesn't happen. That is fantasy. And Malcolm X talked about all of these things and talked about them head on, speaking truth to power. A man who was not violent at all. I want to leave you now with these words spoken at the eulogy of Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. This eulogy, which you may not have heard, parts of it were reprised in Spike Lee's Malcolm X film of 1992. But Ossie Davis, who reprised it in Spike's film, gave the eulogy for Malcolm X. And here is the complete version of it. And that is what I'm going to leave you with. So please listen. And thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.
Here, at this final hour, in this quiet place, Harlem has come to bid farewell to one of its brightest hopes, extinguished now and gone from us forever. For Harlem is where he worked and where he struggled and fought. There are those who will consider it their duty as friends of the Negro people to tell us to revile him, to flee even from the presence of his memory, to save ourselves by writing him out of the history of our turbulent times. Many will ask what Harlem finds to honor in this stormy, controversial, and bold young captain. And we will smile. Many will say, turn away from this man, for he is not a man, but a demon, a monster, a subverter, and an enemy of the black man. And we will smile. They will say that he is of hate, a fanatic, a racist, who can only bring evil to the cause for which you struggle. And we will answer and say unto them, did you ever talk to Brother Malcolm? Did you ever touch him or have him smile at you? Did you ever really listen to him? Did he ever do a mean thing? Was he ever himself associated with violence or any public disturbance? For if you did, you would know him. And if you knew him, you would know why we must honor him. Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood. This was his meaning to his people. And in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves. However much we differed with him, or with each other about him and his value as a man, let his going from us serve only to bring us together now. Consigning these mortal remains to earth, the common mother of all, secure in the knowledge that what we place in the ground is no more now a man, but a seed, which, after the winter of discontent, will come forth again to meet us, and we shall know him then for what he was and is, a prince, our own black shining prince, who did not hesitate to die because he loved us so.